Good morning. This is Saturday, June the 23rd. I'm Ron. Welcome to Storytime. And thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America. And I'm speaking to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So, one of the slogans that you'll hear from the left, from your neighbors and relatives and whatnot, is that there's two sides to every story. How many times have you gotten that one? I've heard that a bunch of times. Wish I had a nickel for every time I heard that one. And it's designed not to further debate or discussion, it's designed to shut you up. That's all there is to it. And usually, when they're using a particular slogan, it's usually because it has a tendency to be self defeating or contradictory in nature. And so, therefore, you just don't know what to say in response to it. But the idea that there is two sides to every story is BS. And again, it's another way of saying nothing can be known with certainty. Therefore, there are two sides to every story. We can't judge. We can't know who's right or who's wrong. And I had an individual at the gym that was trying to make that case. He had started with something about what way things are going to be in a million years, and me and another guy were telling him, "What are you talking about? We won't even be around in a million years." "Oh, well, you don't know that." He starts in with that. So, and I went off on the guy. I was tired of listening to this kind of crap. I knew exactly what he was doing. So at one point, then he starts saying, "Well, there's two sides to every story." I said, "Really? Why don't you tell me the other side to the Hitler story? Why don't you tell me the justify and validate and tell me how the Holocaust was the right thing to do, or how it was morally neutral? I got to hear this." And he shut up. And that's what you need to do when you have any of the lefties in your life. Maybe it might even be a stranger, somebody that comes up to you in the supermarket or something like that, and you're having a discussion. They come up with this, well, there's two sides to every story. Ask them, really, what's the other side of the Hitler story? What's the other side to the story of child molesters? Go ahead and make the case for child molestation. How about for the parents that went ahead and starved and beat their children? Why don't you go ahead and make the case for them? Why don't you tell me how what they did, beating, starving, etc., their children, was actually okay or morally neutral? And I guarantee you're going to shut them up. You'll get a dirty look, but you'll shut them up. And again, that's the way it should be. If the left has something constructive to say, if they have proof and evidence, I'm willing to listen to it. I'll listen to it all day long. If I'm wrong, I'll admit I'm wrong. I want to admit I'm wrong because I come out a smarter, better person for having done so. However, if the left is simply, or some other person is going to just use psychological tools and tactics in order to shut me up, to shunt me off to the side, keep me out of the loop in terms of any public debates or discussions, no, that I'm not going to put up with, not for one hot minute. So remember, it's not so much what the left is saying. It is, you got to ask yourself, what is this person doing? What are they trying to do? What are they hoping to accomplish? As Ayn Rand put it in a rather awkward way, is don't examine her and ask yourself, what is a folly about? Ask what it accomplishes. So it's a very awkward way of saying the same thing. Don't concentrate on what they're saying. Think about what are they doing? What is it they're trying to do here? So, anyways, when I come back, I'm going to be reading the second part of History and Danger of Administrative Law in the September 2014 issue of Imprimis. Okay, thank you very much. And now the part two of the History and Danger of Administrative Law by Philip Hamburger from the Columbia Law School from the September 2014 issue of Imprimis. If I can get the page together here. There we go. It's called the prerogative power of kings. The constitutional history of the past 1,000 years in common law countries records the repeated ebb and flow of absolutism on the one side and law on the other. English kings were widely expected to rule through law. They had parliament for making law and courts of law for adjudicating cases, and they were expected to govern through the acts of these bodies. But kings were discontent with governing through the law and often acted on their own. The personal power that kings exercised when evading the law was called prerogative power. Whereas ordinarily kings bound their subjects through statutes passed by Parliament, when exercising prerogative power, they bound subjects through proclamations or decrees, or what we call today rules or regulations. Whereas ordinarily kings would repeal old statutes by obtaining new statutes, when exercising prerogative power, they issued dispensations and suspensions, or what we call today waivers. Whereas ordinarily kings enforce the law through the courts of law, when exercising prerogative power, they enforce their commands through their prerogative courts, courts such as the King's Council, the Star Chamber, and the High Commission, or what we today call administrative courts. Ordinarily, English judges resolved legal disputes in accordance with their independent judgment regarding the law. But when kings exercised prerogative power, they expected deference from judges, both to their own decrees and to the holdings and interpretations of their extra-legal prerogative courts. Although England did not have a full separation of powers of the sort written into the American Constitution, it did have a basic division of powers. Parliament had the power to make laws, the law courts had the power to adjudicate, and the king had the power to exercise force. But when kings acted through prerogative power, they or the prerogative courts exercised all government powers, overriding these divisions. For example, the Star Chamber could make regulations as well as prosecute and adjudicate infractions. And defenders of this sort of prerogative power were not squeamish about describing it as absolute power. Absolutism was their justification. Conceptually, there were three central elements of this absolutism: extra-legal power, supralegal power, and consolidation of power. It was extra-legal or outside the law in the sense that it bound the public not through laws or statutes, but through other means. It was supralegal or above the law in the sense that kings expected judges to defer to it, notwithstanding their duty to exercise their own independent judgment. And it was consolidated in the sense that it united all government powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the king and in his prerogative courts. And underlying these three central elements was the usual conceptual justification for absolute power: necessity. Necessity, it was said, was not bound by law. These claims on behalf of absolutism, of course, did not go unchallenged. When King John called Englishmen to account extra-legally in his council, England's barons demanded in Magna Carta in 1215 that no free man shall be taken or imprisoned or even summoned except through the mechanisms of law. When 14th century English kings questioned men in the King's Council, Parliament in 1354 and 1368 enacted due process statutes. When King James I attempted to make law through proclamations, judges responded in 1610 with an opinion that royal proclamations were unlawful and void. When James subsequently demanded judicial deference to prerogative interpretation of statutes, the judges refused. Indeed, in 1641, a parliament abolished the Star Chamber and the High Commission, the bodies then engaging in extra-legal lawmaking and adjudication. And most profoundly, English constitutional law began to develop, and it made clear that there could be no extra-legal, supralegal, or consolidated power. Now, because of, I think I've realized that I've kind of made an error here, and that I was supposed to be reading this new last part called The Rise of Absolutism in America. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this as well. The Rise of Absolutism in America. The United States Constitution echoes this. Early Americans were very familiar with absolute power. They feared this extra-legal, supralegal, and consolidated power because they knew from English history that such power could evade the law and override all legal rights. It is no surprise, then, that the United States Constitution was framed to bar this sort of power. To be precise, Americans established the Constitution to be the source of all government power and to bar any absolute power. Nonetheless, Absolute power has come back to life in common law nations, including America. After absolute power was defeated in England and America, it circled back from the continent through Germany, and especially through Prussia. There, what once had been the personal prerogative power of kings became the bureaucratic administrative power of the states. The Prussians were the leaders of this development in the 17th and 18th century. In the 19th century, they became the primary theorists of administrative power, and many of them celebrated its evasion of constitutional law and constitutional rights. This German theory would become the intellectual source of American administrative law. Thousands upon thousands of Americans studied administrative power in Germany, and what they learned there about administrative power became standard fare in American universities. At the same time, in the political sphere, American progressives were becoming increasingly discontent with elected legislatures, and they increasingly embraced German theories of administration and defended the imposition of administrative law in America in terms of pragmatism and necessity. The progressives, moreover, understood what they were doing. For example, in 1927, a leading Crowleyist theorist openly said that the question of whether an American administrative officer could issue regulations was similar to the question of whether pre-modern English kings could issue binding proclamations. By the 1920s, however, Crowleyists increasingly were silent about the continuity between absolute power and modern administrative power, as this undermined their claims about its modernity and lawfulness. In this way, over the past 120 years, Americans have reestablished the very sort of power that the Constitution most centrally forbade. Administrative law is extra-legal in that it binds Americans not through law, but through other mechanisms, not through statutes, but through regulations, and not through the decisions of courts, but through other adjudications. It is supra-legal in that it requires judges to put aside their independent judgment and defer to administrative power as if it were above the law, which our judges do far more systematically than even the worst of 17th century English judges. And it is consolidated in that it combines the three powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, in administrative agencies. Let me close by addressing just two of the many constitutional problems illuminated by the reemergence of absolutism in the form of administrative power: delegation and procedural rights. One standard defense of administrative power is that Congress uses statutes to delegate its lawmaking power to administrative agencies. But this is a poor defense. The delegation of lawmaking has long been a familiar feature of absolute power. When kings exercised extra-legal power, they usually had at least some delegated authority from Parliament. Henry VIII, for example, issued binding proclamations under an authorizing statute called the Act of Proclamation. His binding proclamations were nonetheless understood to be exercises of absolute power. In the 18th century, the Act of Proclamations was condemned as unconstitutional. Against this background, the United States Constitution expressly bars the delegation of legislative power. This may sound old or odd, given that opposite is so commonly asserted by scholars and so routinely accepted by courts, but read the Constitution. The Constitution's very first substantive words are, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States." The word all was not placed there by accident. The framers understood that delegation had been a problem in English constitutional history, and the word all was placed there precisely to bar it. As for procedural rights, the history is even more illuminating. Administrative adjudication evades almost all of the procedural rights guaranteed under the Constitution. It subjects Americans to adjudication without real judges, without juries, without grand juries, without full protection against self-incrimination, and so forth. Like the old prerogative courts, administrative courts substitute inquisitorial process for the due process of law. And that's not just an abstract accusation. Much early administrative procedure appears to have been modeled on civilian-derived inquisitional process. Administrative adjudication thus became an open avenue for evasion of the Bill of Rights. The standard justification for administrative evasion of procedural rights is that they apply centrally to the regular courts, but not entirely to administrative adjudication. But the history shows that procedural rights develop primarily to bar prerogative or administrative proceedings, not to regulate what the government does in regular courts of law. As I already mentioned, the principle of due process developed as early as the 14th century when Parliament used it to prevent the exercise of extra-legal power by the King's Council. It then became a constitutional principle in the 17th century in opposition to the prerogative courts. Similarly, jury rights developed partly in opposition to administrative proceedings, and thus some of the earliest constitutional cases in America held administrative proceedings unconstitutional for depriving defendants of a jury trial. In sum, the conventional understanding of administrative law is utterly mistaken. It is wrong on the history and oblivious to the danger. That danger is absolutism, extralegal, supralegal, and consolidated power. And the danger matters because administrative power revives this absolutism. The Constitution carefully barred this threat, but constitutional doctrine has since legitimized this dangerous sort of power. It therefore is necessary to go back to basics. Among other things, we should no longer settle for some vague notion of rule of law, understood as something that allows the delegation of legislative and judicial powers to administrative agencies. We should demand rule through law and rule under law. Even more fundamentally, we need to reclaim the vocabulary of law. Rather than speak of administrative law, we should speak of administrative power, indeed of absolute power, or more concretely, of extralegal, supralegal, and consolidated power. Then we can at least begin to recognize the danger. And that concludes this particular issue of Imprimis, September 2014. And Philip Hamburger is the Maurice and Hilda Friedman Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. He received his BA from Princeton University and his JD from Yale Law. He's also taught at the University of Chicago Law School, the George Washington University Law School, the University of Virginia Law School, and Northwestern Law School. A contributor to National Review Online, he's written for several law reviews and journals, including the American Journal of Legal History, the Supreme Court Review, the Notre Dame Law Review, and the Journal of Law and Politics. He is the author of Separation of Church and State, Law and Judicial Duty, and most recently, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? This article was adapted from a speech delivered on May 6, 2014 at Hillsdale College's Allen P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship in Washington, D.C. So Imprimis is a free magazine. It's a very small magazine. Usually there's just one article, pamphlet maybe is even a better way to put it. But it's from Hillsdale College. But if you look it up online, IMPRIMIS, you would be able to find the website in which you can go ahead and get registered to receive free copies of Imprimis. So when I come back, I'm going to be doing a little bit of house and philosophy. Thank you. And so I've been reading, I read a little bit of this House and Philosophy, and it's a series of books, and it's and philosophy. So you got House and Philosophy, and then there is The Simpsons and Philosophy, and all kinds of, usually television shows is what they're doing, and it's to show get in deep and show that the philosophical components, underlying philosophical components of these shows. So, in this one particular case, it's about House, who is a very blunt and very difficult to deal with doctor at a teaching hospital on the East Coast. And it talks about his attitudes and whatnot and relates it to philosophy. Unlike many, House doesn't find religious belief, specifically the idea of an afterlife, all that comforting. At one point he says, I find it more comforting to believe that this life isn't simply a test. from the episode called Three Stories. Even putting aside House's views for the moment, there are serious problems with the idea that God dictates the meaning of our lives. Think of great scientists who better our lives with their discoveries, or humanitarians who tirelessly work to improve the world, or entertainers, even like Hugh Laurie, who make our lives more enjoyable. Do we really want to say that if there's no God, then these accomplishments and goods don't count? A further and fatal problem, first presented about a similar idea in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, from which I now shamelessly borrow, is this: what makes God's plan meaningful in the first place? Is it meaningful simply because it's God's plan, or does God plan because it's meaningful? If it's the former, then the plan is simply arbitrary. There's no reason behind it, and therefore it could just as easily been the opposite. But this doesn't sit well. Surely not just any old thing could be meaningful. Instead, most would say God's plan is as it is because God sees that such a course of events would be meaningful. But if this is right, then something else, besides God's will, makes the plan meaningful. So the meaning in our life has nothing to do with God. House is right about that, whether or not God exists. And the problem with this is that it's a rigged they rigged the game. And what they're basically doing is part of Christian doctrine. I probably all religious doctrines that God, the intelligence of God, is such that we cannot understand. We do not and cannot understand the mind of God. But here, the author of this book pretends to do exactly that, and suggesting that, and also that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And so this guy's putting limits on God, saying, well, that he's only basically got two choices. He can do it this way, or he can do it that way, and either which way God goes, God's decree or God's will makes no sense. Baloney. Again, the author doesn't have any special insights about God, hasn't met God. There's no reason to believe that anything that he is saying is worth taking seriously. Again, he contradicts himself, and so he should be disregarded. Eternity, anyone? Perhaps just the fact that we have souls gives us intrinsic value and makes our lives meaningful, or perhaps it has something to do with the idea that souls are supposed to be immortal and live on in an afterlife. If there is an afterlife, then this life is meaningful because it's leading somewhere. But House no more believes in the soul than he does in God, and he's convinced there's no afterlife as well. No evidence, right? What about so-called near-death experiences? Do they provide evidence of the afterlife? In the season 4 episode 97 Seconds, a patient tries to kill himself because he believes in the afterlife and he wants to be there. He has already been clinically dead and brought back, and while dead, he had experiences in a beautiful, peaceful afterlife. He says, the paramedics said that I was technically dead for 97 seconds. It was the best 97 seconds of my life. House, of course, won't stand for any of this. He tells the patient, okay, here's what happened. Your oxygen-deprived brain shutting down, flooded endorphins, serotonin, and gave you the visions. In the same episode, the afterlife theme comes up again as a dying cancer patient refuses the treatment that would prolong his painful life. He prefers death and tells House and Wilson, I've been trapped in this useless body long enough, and it'd be nice to finally get out. House blasts back. Get out and go where? You think you're going to sprout wings and start flying around with the other angels? Don't be an idiot. There's no after. There's just this. Wilson and House then leave and have this wonderful exchange. Wilson, you can't let a dying man take solace in his beliefs? House, his beliefs are stupid. Wilson, why can't you just let him have his fairy tale if it gives him comfort to imagine beaches and loved ones and life outside a wheelchair? House, there's 72 virgins too? Wilson, it's over. He's got days, maybe hours left. What pain does it cause him if he spends that time with a peaceful smile? What sick pleasure do you get in making damn sure he's filled with fear and dread? House, he shouldn't be making a decision based on a lie. Misery is better than nothing. Wilson, you don't know there's nothing. You haven't been there. House rolls his eyes. Oh, God, I'm tired of that argument. I don't have to go to Detroit to know that it smells. But House, ever the scientist, wants proof. He's going to see for himself. He arranges to kill himself and is clinically dead for a short time before being brought back. At the end of the episode, he stands over the body of a patient who has since died and says, "I'm sorry to say, I told you so." What would House have said if there were an afterlife and God called him to account? Probably, "You should have given more evidence." Whether House's little experiment proved anything or not, what should we say about meaning in eternity? House, the philosopher, disagrees with the sentiment that life has to be leading somewhere to give it meaning. Consider this exchange between House and his patient Eve, who is raped in the brilliant episode One Day, One Room. House, if you believe in eternity, then life is irrelevant, the same as a bug is irrelevant in comparison to the universe. Eve, if you don't believe in eternity, then what you do here is irrelevant. House, your acts here are all that matters. Eve, then nothing matters. There's no ultimate consequences. The patient expresses the idea that if this is all there is, then what's the point? But for House, if this is all there is, then what we do here is the only thing that matters. In fact, it makes it matter all that much more. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that, and maybe make a comment next time. But I'll just leave it at that because I like this series, the introduction series, because it's deep. It's there's a lot of thoughtfulness that's going on here, and so much of what I hear on the radio, see on television, is so shallow. So when I come back, it is going to be time for Sun Stories. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And so this is Sun Stories, Tales from Around the World to Illuminate the Days and Nights of Our Life, by Carolyn McVicker Edwards. And so it's basically she's more of, I guess, rather than the author, an editor or compiler. She brought together all these different stories from different tribes around the world about the sun. And so now I've read the first one. This one's called How Shamash the Sun Rescued the Prince of Fertility from Ancient Canaan. This myth, one of the oldest stories in the world, has the modern flavor of an adventure comic book. It can be read as a map for both seasonal and psychological solstices. Winter arrives, the god of green disappears. Sun is responsible for bringing him back. The way of the psyche always calls for balance. Both the king of fertility and the king of sterility must be given their due. A myth can describe human experiences never dreamed of by its originators. We moderns find ourselves in an eco-cultural transition for which this ancient tale may bear direction. Baal, king of the world, throws himself an extravagant party in his opulent new castle. Like so many of us in the energy-profligate First World, Baal fails to include Mot, the Lord of Death, among the glitterati on his guest list. Indeed, Mot is Lord of Entropy, that simple rule of physics so repugnant to and little known by the most reckless users of energy on the planet. Entropy is the law that promises ultimate death for everything, that predicts that all energy disperses finally until it is static and irretrievable. The law of entropy promises ends and final death. But entropy neither predicts nor controls the speed at which we advance toward those limits. The more simply we live, the less energy we expend, the longer the time we have. In the eco-cultural reading of this myth, it is probably no accident that Baal's fatal excursion into the underworld is preceded by his ostentatious expenditures of energy. Baal finds that his way back to life is a direct relationship with Sun, mother of all energy. The modern technology we have for a direct relationship with the sun is also entropically sound. Although every use of energy must finally submit to the law of entropy, the use of direct solar energy will drastically slow our advance toward that end. Solar technology obliges us to use labor rather than energy-intensive, small-scale processes and machinery, and to lead lifestyles that focus on the simple, the reusable, and the homemade. The discovery in 1928 of the Ras Samra tablets on the site of the ancient city of Ugarit in northern Syria opened up new understandings of this pre-biblical Semitic mythology. Before this, We were aware of these myth cycles only through fragments preserved by Greek historiographers. The Ras Samra tablets, badly damaged, are written in what looks like cuneiform, but is actually an alphabet. The language, related to Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew, was unknown before the discovery of the tablets and is now called Ugaritic. The tablets date from the 14th century BC, but their stories have much earlier origins. There are three major myths tell of the adventures of Baal and of two kings, Kerit and Akwat. An Egyptian version of this Ugaritic myth, the Astarte papyrus dating between 1550 and 1200 BC, bridges the gaps in Baal's story that have literally been destroyed by time. Shamash the sun plays a central role in the story because of her unique ability to travel freely back and forth from the under to the upper world. Here, Baal is simply the prince of fertility, but in later stories, he supplants the father god El. He eventually became identified with so many different deities, including the Hebrew Yahweh, that his name came to mean simply Lord, representing a composite of many gods. In Arabic, rainwater soil is still called land of Baal, while arid and barren places are called Mawat, a cognate with the name of Mot, prince of sterility. The water boy god Ashtar, too small to be the king of the earth, represents the power of artificial irrigation. Eftari in Arabic, a form of Ashtar, still refers to soil so watered. Baal's sister, the goddess Anat, rules over war and slaughter as well as love and fertility. Astarte, Baal's love interest, is queen of the night sky. The souls of humans not yet born and already dead live in her stars. Okay, so I'm going to leave this one there. That was the introduction to how Shamash the sun rescued the Prince of Fertility, and we'll see about going ahead and reading the actual fable or tale next time on the show. So with that, that concludes another episode of Story Time, and I thank you very much for listening, and until next time, have a great day.